which is obviously very important. So thank you for being here, all of our panelists. This session will be recorded, and so if you don't want to be shown on video, please feel free to bring down your video. I wanted to start off talking a little bit about AAPI and study abroad. So I'm going to just start off by sharing some statistics, because I know the first thing I want to know is, what does it look like nationally? What does it look like for UCEAP and the UC system? Where are students going? Who's going? And so I just want to quickly share some statistics, and then we'll jump to our panelists and some of the questions for them. So I thought this was pretty interesting. This is national data. So about, and it's comparing how many students are enrolled in post-secondary enrollment versus how many of them study abroad. And specifically for Asian Pacific Islander, considering nationally how many of us are enrolled in post-secondary enrollment, a good percentage are studying abroad. So we have more AAPI students studying abroad and more representation there than we'd have in just the general enrollment. So that's something that I found really, really interesting. And then this is data pulled from our UCEAP research team. So thank you them for helping them, and specifically Emily Graham. So she was kind enough to pull this data for us, which I also thought was really interesting. This is going through the last 5 years, essentially. Keep in mind that COVID did, changes things. But again, even on the UC level, if we were to look at the numbers for the AAPI community, the AAPI community is, fairly strongly represented, particularly when you look at how many students are studying abroad compared to enrollment. Again, so similar to the national data, but this is looking at just the UC system. And so, Asian Americans represent about 30%, and Pacific Islanders represent about 30%, and we're about 24% of them studying abroad. So it's slightly lower than the national average, but still definitely representation is happening there. One thing I did really want to share in this presentation, however, is that there is very little research and data about the Asian American Pacific Islander community in the study abroad space. So I was sharing with some of our panelists earlier this morning that, in preparation for this presentation, and even just in preparation for my role as a study abroad advisor, I wanted to educate myself and see what research exists, were there best practices for advising for Asian American and Pacific Islander students for study abroad. And I found one published paper, literally one, and that was from 2008. And when I reached out to the author and said, hey, are there any updates? Have you still been doing anything in this work? You know of anything else? She responded, there is nothing else. There's very little research being done in this space, which is unfortunate because we do make a significant representation within the population, and that all of her research that was done in 2008 is probably no longer applicable because everything is post-COVID and it's so outdated. And so it's really, really important that we're having this AAPI programming. So I just appreciate that all of you are here today and joining us with this presentation. And I hope to inspire some additional research in this area. But sorry, and I also should have shared, I forgot I had one more slide. I also was really interested in where the API population is going, like where are they studying abroad, what programs are they choosing, what are the topics of interest. So I quickly wanted to share this slide as well. The top 5 countries I thought was interesting was South Korea, Italy, UK, specifically London, and less so the other areas of the UK, Spain and Taiwan. And then we also broke it down by which institutions they're visiting, and then also which particular programs. So I was curious, like, are they mostly going for UC Center programs? And are they, I'm sorry, I just realized this is a double. Are they going for research programs? And so the one within Taiwan usually was the research program in Taiwan, but otherwise they were mostly the UC Center programs or UNC University, which I just thought was interesting. I want to share that data. But you did not come here to research, learn about data. You came here to learn about our panelists. So we are so happy to have them. And actually, Kira is not with us, but we do have Alicia. So thank you for joining us, Alicia. And then we also have a panelist who is not a heritage student, but did and had a last minute job interview for this time slot. But I was able to connect with him earlier this morning, and he told me his answers to some of the questions. So I'll be sharing some of his responses as well. But I'm going to move to the Q&A session, and I'm going to stop screen sharing so we can see our panelists. So why don't we start with introductions? So if each of you can introduce yourselves, where you studied abroad, and how you chose your program, that would be wonderful. Alicia, I'll start with you.
Okay, hi everyone. Good morning. My name's Alicia. I'm currently a fourth year linguistics with Spanish emphasis major and a TESOL minor. And I studied abroad for an entire year in Chile. So I'm also a non-heritage student. And I chose Chile specifically because it was related to my studies. I wanted a program with full immersion and something that would kind of enrich my perspective on Spanish linguistics.
Awesome, thank you. Anna, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Anna Wynn, and I use she, her pronouns. I graduated with a psychology degree from UCLA in 2019, and I studied abroad in Hong Kong at the University of Hong Kong. And I ended up choosing Hong Kong specifically for their Cantonese program, language program that they offer. And I wanted to learn to deepen my language learning in that language specifically. And I chose Hong Kong also because my family lived there for a year in a refugee camp because they were leaving Vietnam as refugees during the Vietnam War and went from Vietnam to Hong Kong and then to the US when they were sponsored to come over. So I think it was it was very important to me to return and to learn more about that area.
Awesome, thank you, Anna. And Justin, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, good morning. My name is Justin Kaito Church. I am a recent graduate of UC Berkeley. I studied at the University of Tokyo as part of the STEM Research in Tokyo program. And I chose that program because I knew I wanted to do something like research related. And then because it was research, I decided I wanted to do a country where I actually spoke the language and could understand what I'm actually researching. And I ended up choosing Japan as part of that. So I am a heritage student in that regard.
Awesome. Thank you three of you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time to share your insights and your experiences. I'm going to start with your family. So whether you decided to go for heritage reasons or not heritage or non-heritage reasons, what were your family's reactions to your decision to study abroad? And were there aspects that they had difficulty understanding or gaps of understanding that you needed to fulfill? And feel free to just pop, if anyone wants to speak up or not answer is fine too.
Yeah, so luckily my parents are very supportive, and they're kind of the ones that instilled this like passion for travel and culture in me from a young age. So in that regard, there was not really any difficulty in actually studying abroad, but definitely in my decision to choose a country that they were unfamiliar with, something that was kind of far away and for so long. It did take a little bit of persuading. And on the other hand, my grandparents, when I told them that I would be studying abroad in Chile, they were very worried for me. They had a couple stereotypical notions of the area that I was studying abroad in. So that also took a little bit of time, but just explaining and doing my research and sharing all the information that I had with them, everything worked out, and they're very happy that I went now.
I guess I can hop in. I think my family was similarly very supportive, especially because it was a country that we have visited as a family before. So although I've never been in like the Tokyo area of Japan, I've been in like other regions of Japan because I have family there. So they were supportive. My family in Japan were like, come visit. And then I think like the main question that they had was related to finances, just because the way that like financial aid works is very different because mine was over summer and that is its entire thing, and also just study abroad financial aid works very differently, and I remember having to do like a lot of, I guess, research related to that.
Um, I So I remember my family being excited because, and my grandfather connecting me to his niece that lived in Vietnam. And so I was able to go to Vietnam during Reading Week, which is like a time period where folks get like a week off before exams in Hong Kong. And I was able to meet with my extended family members in Vietnam too. But I remember my grandparents being like excited. Um, in terms of finances too, I think that was a piece that I more so had because at that point, um, I was financially independent and paying my way through college. And so it was a big piece for me as well, choosing Hong Kong because it was actually cheaper to go to study abroad than to stay at my home institution, which I thought was really interesting at the time. And so I ended up choosing Hong Kong because of that as well. And had ended up applying for the UCAP Promise Award, I believe. It's like $2,000 that you can apply to your study abroad. And I remember writing a little essay for that. And so, finance wise, I don't think anyone asked me about that because they were kind of like, oh, Anna's doing her own thing. So, I think my mom was just more so like, okay, like you're independent, you're an adult, like you're doing your thing, studying abroad. And she was just kind of excited for me.
Yeah, I wanted to share the perspective of the student who, again, had a job interview, unfortunately, last minute, and wasn't able to join us. His experience was quite interesting, where his family had specifically he's heritage is from Vietnam, and his family had told him specifically he could not study abroad in Vietnam, because they felt like what could you learn there? Like you can learn everything from us there, you go somewhere different. And I thought that was an interesting perspective, and so he ended up studying abroad in another country, and so in Norway. But I just wanted to bring that up as a possible scenario that potentially could happen as well, where there are potentially conceptions of, a ton of support for heritage seeking students, and then potentially the other way around. And so I just wanted to bring both of those perspectives. I'm going to start with just the heritage students, so just Justin and Anna for now. So what would you say, because both of you did study for heritage reasons, and so what would you say that you did gain from studying abroad that you wouldn't have been able to if you had stayed here? Like, let's just say if you just joined the local group from your heritage or just from your family, like what did you gain from actually going to the country that you did?
I was looking at Justin's screen. I was like, oh, I don't know. I can jump in though. Let's see. I so my grandparents, they never spoke about their experience living in Vietnam or Hong Kong, or coming to the US really. And so it was very mysterious to me. My aunts and uncles, they were and my mom was very young at the time. And so she didn't really remember very much of that experience coming to the US. And so um, I think I had a lot of curiosity about these places, that I don't think I would have been able to get um, from them, specifically. And I think it really benefited me to see the places that they had seen, maybe, or to live. I had visited like the old family home, from what like my grandparents remembered, and the neighborhood they lived in, when they were living in Hong Kong as refugees. And so I think that was really important to me. And they hadn't gone back. I think I had one aunt that had gone back, to Vietnam and Hong Kong too, but it wasn't really something that we talked about. And even though I was like lucky enough to like grow up in Orange County, where there's a huge Vietnamese population and Chinese population, it's still, I don't think it would have provided that experience that I was looking for to get that kind of cultural identity, to kind of fulfill the cultural identity search I was on, and then also kind of get that experience at its like quote unquote like source instead of this experience through someone else.
Thank you for sharing, Anna.
I think for me, a lot of the people that I know who also studied abroad tended to go for like language reasons. Like I had a friend who went to Taiwan to practice Mandarin, or and like other people who went so they could like practice the language in like a place that actually speaks language regularly. And I think for me it wasn't as much because I spoke Japanese growing up. I think it was more like learning, I guess, the more formal businessy sort of Japanese language, and I think being able to practice that. But what I didn't expect to gain was like this large sense of community, especially between like the other people who were studying abroad. I think even now, like we still talk regularly. We spent like every weekend together, like a little too many weekends together, just like traveling all over Japan. And then also the community at the university, the lab I was staying with was like a very open and like welcoming lab, and we did like a lot of activities together. And I think it was just a lot of being able to meet people who I don't think I would have been able to meet otherwise. And I think that sense of community was something I didn't expect to gain, but was something I really appreciated.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm going to transition to Alicia really quickly, who did not study abroad for heritage reasons. So did you consider studying abroad for heritage reasons? And then like what factors did you, if so, what factors did you weigh when deciding which country you ultimately decide to go with?
Yeah, so I did consider it. I did actually consider Hong Kong as well because my family is from there. And I had gone a couple times like throughout my childhood, so I was kind of already familiar, at least with Hong Kong and the culture and the language there. So really, my decision to go the non-heritage route was let me travel to a place or let me study abroad in a place where I know I would have like UCEAP support and somewhere that I wouldn't necessarily go by myself in the future, or kind of like when other time in my lifetime would I be in South America for a year kind of by myself. Yeah, so kind of me being in Asia, I knew that I had personal resources like family and friends and just connections that I could use in a different situation if I wanted to be there. And then Chile specifically, as I said, it kind of gave me that all immersive package. Like I took all of my classes in Spanish. I did 2 internships in Spanish. Um, I lived with the host family for part of my program. So those were kind of the main factors that really drew me to that program specifically.
No, thank you. And I would say your answer is very similar to the student who unfortunately couldn't make it. The only thing that I would add that I thought was interesting is that he did mention a conversation he had with his mom where she did say, "Oh, but I don't want you to get too close to the Norwegian culture because don't forget you're still Vietnamese." And I thought that was like just an interesting sentiment where you know, his family was encouraging him to study abroad, not in his heritage area, but then also wanted to maintain that identity. And so we had a really good session about that, and how there is a pull for those who decide to not go to a non-heritage student. Alicia, as you mentioned, you spent a significant amount of time getting to know that culture and speaking Spanish. And so you know, I think obviously there's ways that you can embrace both cultures, but that is a dynamic that sometimes can be difficult to navigate at times for students. This is for all of you. So, what were your expectations going into it, and then what was the reality? And in particular, I think, especially for the heritage students, I'm thinking, Anna, for example, I know you mentioned like, hoping to think more about your identity. Were you able to fill that, and were there, deltas between your reality and your expectation? Or were there ways that your experience exceed your expectations?
Um, when I was thinking about this question beforehand, I was like, oh, I don't know if I had any expectations, but I think I definitely was wondering kind of what that homecoming would feel like. And I don't know if I necessarily felt like I was more Asian or anything as I like came to the homeland. I remember reading Amy Tan's like book Joy Luck Club, and there's a character in there that goes to China and she's like, "Oh, I feel a lot more Chinese. I'm becoming Chinese." And I was like, "Oh, that's what I want. I want to feel like that." And I think I learned a lot, but I think I also kind of demystified what it meant to be Asian. Like I could meet every family member I could possibly like locate in the homelands, and I did. I met, you know, my family in Vietnam and then in Hong Kong, and they were so lovely. It felt really natural and very exciting, I think, to be able to have like dinner and lunch with them and to have them show me around their homes. And so that was extremely lovely and exceeded my expectations. But I think it was just, um, I didn't necessarily like go through a transformation like I had expected like to do after like like learning more about the language, learning more about my culture, etc. I think it just kind of helped me demystify what it means to be Asian American, and that's like these feelings of being half are a part of that experience, or and it's never going to be like a whole, like I'm never going to feel like wholly Asian. It's going to be like, oh, I'm Asian American, so of course these are things like broken customs, broken language, broken relationships. These are things that are a part of like the diaspora experience.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Justin and Alicia, and feel free not to if you don't want to share, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity if you want to share anything about expectations versus reality. And if not, it's okay. Okay. And this is also for all three of you. How did your Asian American identity affect your life abroad? So, and you can interpret that in any ways, like whether you were perceived as Asian, whether you were perceived as American, or you were perceived as Asian American. So you could take any part of that, and you know, feel free to answer like how did that affect your experience?
I can start on this one. This one is something that I thought about constantly while I was there and since then, since I've come back. But it was really interesting because in Chile, there's not a lot of kind of like third culture. People there are Chilean, even if they have like other ancestry, indigenous European ancestry, they aren't connected in that way that like Asian Americans are. So I found that a lot of people, even my close friends, close local friends, had trouble understanding and would sometimes ask me things, but I knew that it didn't come from like a mean-spirited place. They just really were not familiar with this type of culture or like those terms. And then just on a regular basis, people would not believe that I was American just by, you know, looking at me. Um, so yeah, it was a lot of navigating that, kind of navigating who I wanted to explain things to and who I didn't want to, or like whether or not it was kind of worth it. If it's just kind of an interaction on the street, I kind of let people think what they wanted to think. But if it was close friends and I knew that they were willing to listen and they would value my thoughts and my opinions, I would kind of share more about my background and my identity and like everything that was going on in my head. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to quickly share the response of the student that's unable to join us. This is very similar. He went to a Scandinavian country, and also had some you know, challenges in education, about him being presenting as an Asian, but then being an American. And so he did share about how he commonly got the question of like, where are you from? And he specifically has said that the first like month about like he would get really annoyed and offended by the question, but he was really grateful for the study abroad experiences. You have that time, and that essentially time where he said so much more eloquently, so I'll try to my best to give it justice, but like, he had the time to get to know the people and understand exactly what you said, Alicia, that it didn't come from a place of malice. From a place of curiosity. And so he was able to then understand, like, oh no, you're asking because you want more, you want to learn about me, like you're not asking to offend me in any way, you're asking because you want more knowledge, you want to learn more about the world. And so he said one of his biggest takeaways from studying abroad is not being offended by that question anymore. And he gets that in the US, of course, and normally would have that reaction, but then now he has a much healthier relationship with that question. And I thought that was just a really interesting takeaway from his experience.
I guess I can hop in. And I see there's also a question in the chat, but answering first the question that was asked. I think when I was in middle school, I had like a teacher tell me like, "Oh, to the Asians, you'll always be like an American. To the Americans, you'll always be an Asian." And I think there was like kind of like living through that, where I think to like a lot of the other study abroad people, because I knew Japanese, I tended to be like the Japanese translator, and then vice versa for my lab mates, I would like translate stuff into English, and like I was more than happy to do that. But I do think there was a little bit of that where I was just like, okay, like how I'm perceived because of my lived experiences. But I think there was also a recognition where, because my education was primarily in the United States, like my education was very American. I remember like discussing with some of the people in the lab, like their educational upbringing. And it was very interesting seeing like how even something I didn't consider like college culture, like I imagined it to be different, but I didn't realize how different it was because of the way they do college. Like I think in the US, my experience at least with the UC system has been like it's still like a very rigorous environment versus like a university in Japan, the University of Tokyo, even though it's like one of the most renowned universities in the nation. It's something that once students get into, they're able to like relax a lot more because the hard part was getting in, not actually graduating. And I think just things like that made me realize like yes, I have like this Asian American heritage, and yes, I have this like Asian background, but my lived experiences are inherently going to be different from those that I'm interacting with, and I think that's a really interesting experience.
Thank you for sharing, Justin. I'm gonna move on to the next question unless anyone, okay. Has your study abroad experience changed your relationship with your parents or your family, or just your relationship with your identity with your culture? And I know we've kind of touched on some of these elements, but I wanted to specifically ask about now that you've come back and returned, has there been any changes in your again, your relationship with your family or just like with your culture? And I could share the experience that the student mentioned, that again, unfortunately is an intermediary. He has, again, because he went to a Scandinavian country, he was saying that he actually came back with a stronger pride of his Vietnamese culture, just because he felt like he was constantly representing it. And he was saying like he feels like he's representing it here in San Diego, but not to the extent that, where oftentimes he was like the first time anyone's ever met someone who's Vietnamese. And so he just, as he was like constantly explaining things, he joked about like how to properly pronounce pho, for example, because he was just constantly representing his culture. He just gained like a whole new sense of pride, because as he was like relaying those stories, just different aspects of the culture, he's like, that is really cool that I get to, that this is a part of who I am. So I thought, so it definitely, even though he wasn't even a heritage student, the study abroad experience did foster stronger ties to his heritage culture, which I just thought was an interesting after effect from his study abroad experience.
I really love that answer because that's not something that came to my mind, but I definitely felt that too as a non-heritage student, kind of being that representative. Yeah, and I really enjoyed kind of just exposing my friends to Asian culture, even though it wasn't my Asian culture. Santiago in Chile had kind of like a Koreatown with an Asian market. So I would take them there and go eat Korean food there or shop at the Asian market and show them like all the snacks that I ate growing up. So yeah, kind of just having those little experiences and knowing that people are open to those experiences and open to listening and learning um, was really cool. And I do come back feeling more connected to kind of my Asian culture and knowing how privileged I am to live in California where I do have that community.
Um, I felt a lot closer to my grandparents after going abroad. Um, and I remember being very excited to share with them all of the new words in Cantonese that I had learned and all of the new people I had met. And I think that was a big point of pride. I think also a big point of pride was being able to share with my friends and family and just like more people like, oh, this is what it's like um in like Hong Kong or Vietnam, and to be able to share like the cultural aspects that I had learned and observed. And I feel like it answered this like pressing question, like coming back at it, like had answered the pressing question of like, who am I? So being able to retrace the steps helped me better understand who I was too in my early 20s, and has really informed kinds of things that I want to pass on to my children, things that I'd like to focus on. For example, one of the things was like wanting to create like a family tree, and being really excited about that. Um, yeah. And to record stories as well. I think I came back and was like, I want to make a family tree, record all these stories that I've heard, keep in touch with family members. And of course, like it's been some time since 2018 when I studied abroad. And I think like being here reminds me that that's still something that I want to do and get to.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Anna.
I think for me, it was less about like learning more about what it means to be Japanese or what it means to be American, but more like what it means to be Japanese American. And I think being able to see like I think I had like always a sense of like I am Japanese, like I even have a Japanese passport, and then I am American because I've lived my entire life in America. So I think there was like a sense of that, but I don't think there was a lot of like merging in the context of an Asian culture. So I think being able to experience that where I was an Asian American was really helpful. And I think going to Elizabeth's question, like potential emotional burnout, I think at first it was like a little weird just because I was like, did I already tell you this? I don't know. I feel like I'm a mansplaining about myself. I don't know how that's possible. But I think a lot of it came down to I was really lucky with the people in my lab. One, there were a lot of people from other countries. Like there was someone from Norway, there was someone from like the East Coast of the United States. So I think they came from different things, and it was less like you are on a spotlight talking about yourself, but more it's like a circle kind of like giving their experiences, and like, you're learning so much about yourself. So I think in that regards, it was less burnout in because it wasn't just focused on you.
And thank you all for sharing. I'm gonna move to the question that, and I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Gemina, asked in the chat, which is with your Asian American identity, are there experiences from your study abroad that portrayed your identity or allowed you to learn more about your identity?
I maybe not necessarily my identity, but um, something really interesting was that I ended up meeting some um, Asian Latinas while I was abroad. So kind of just learning more about the diaspora and the like immigration patterns from China to different areas. I met someone whose family was from Hong Kong, I believe, and they've been in Chile for like 10 years. And then someone who was Mexican but had a Chinese grandfather, so he kind of knew some of the culture. And then I was also able to meet some of the people that used to work in the Korean consulate in Santiago. Um, and they kind of shared their experiences with their own immigration to Chile. Um, so just kind of building that um, broader understanding of the diaspora was something that I didn't expect to do, but kind of helped me understand like Asian identity and all of the different aspects of that.
I know I'm not one of the panelists, but I'm gonna answer just because I have a very specific example that I actually talk to students about a lot. And I think for me, when I've been abroad and studying abroad, is all these little interactions that later on you look back and you're like, ooh, that was interesting. So I remember a very distinctive interaction that I had where someone had specifically told me like, wow, you're really smiley for a Chinese girl. And I remember thinking like, but I'm an American, and like we're known for being friendly. And then I realized like, oh no, you see me as just what my face looks like. And you're completely omitting the fact that I was born and raised in the US. And even though I speak fluent Chinese, I think it just as I was trying to think of my reaction to that interaction, it just made me think about all of my identities and how all that just plays in it. And it was just such a subtle moment, but I still think about that one time and how I almost, I kind of like ran through all these things in my head and it's like, well, and also, there's a lot to unpack there, right? Because there's also, well, a lot to unpack there, but just in general, if we're just focusing on my personal identity, it made me interested. I never, because my parents are from Taiwan. I always identify myself as Taiwanese. That was the first time that my first thought was like, oh, an American. I'm an American first, and I never thought that before. And so, for me abroad, again, it's all these like little interactions that kind of then add up to my identity. Usually it's not this like big splashy thing where I'm like, you all listen to my, or any, it's these small things. And Elaine, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so similar to Emily, I studied abroad in Spain. I'm many years removed. I'm an academic specialist at UCEAP, so I've worked with some of you while you were abroad. But I lived with a host family in Spain, and I remember my host brother, said, "Oh, you're not like the other American students we've had. You are more respectful. You have, and they know about Filipino culture. The Philippines was a colony of Spain. And so later on, it did come out like, oh, okay, you're kind of more Filipino, I guess, than American in the way that you address things or So that was interesting, similar to Emily, where it's like, oh, one identity over the other. But at the same time, it's like they're both there. But like one is emphasized, depending on the context or whoever you're with. But that was just interesting too, where I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I am more Filipino in some ways. So yeah, just want to share that.
Thank you for sharing. And again, this is a open panel, so if anyone else has any experiences they want to share, please feel free to, even if you're not an official panelist. And then, I'm also going to join. Thank you for asking the question, because at the end of the day, I want everyone to gain from this as much as they can, even though I have preset questions. Like, please, let's just get like the answers that you want to gain. Were there any struggles? And that's very similar to a question I have right here. So let's jump to it. Were there any struggles you experienced while studying abroad being an Asian American, and what are some ways that you overcame them?
I can add some of my experiences for this. I I mean, I think aside from like kind of figuring out finances before studying abroad, I think that was one of them, but like specifically to being like Asian American while abroad. Um, I think I stayed in a dorm, like student housing with five other girls, and we had like lived in a triple, like a in like a double, like in double rooms, and we had like three beds in one room. So it was a lot of like close interactions. And I had a lot of European like roommates who were also studying abroad from their respective like home countries and like colleges. And I think one of the challenges was micro and sometimes like macro aggressions that were shared, for example. But also, and it was odd because I was both being raised in like kind of like Western culture and being a part of the international like student experience, but also a part because then you're also Asian and American, like Asian American. I think there are things about like beauty that had brought up by my like Italian roommates at the time, and they were like, "Oh, you know, it's like isn't this model so much prettier than, you know, this other Asian model? Like, why would someone choose the Asian model over, you know, this like white person essentially?" And I think, and there are other things like, oh, I don't like Chinese food, and it's not like the meat isn't good. It's like not good like in Europe and so forth. And there are like these things that were said. And I mean, of course, these are people can have their own personal opinions, but I think these kind of like dove a little bit further in than just opinions. There were definitely aggressions. And I think in those cases, it was important for me to, I mean, I felt upset. And so I would say, like, what do you mean by that? Like, can you kind of clarify why you would say so and so was like had better qualities? Because these are both like beautiful folks. Like why is it that you know feel like one is better than the other? And I think there's a lot of like internal like Western beauty standards. I had to like address like these Western beauty standards that had been instilled, um, and kind of wanting to stand up for my culture and the folks that look like me, and to recognize that like um, our features are just as beautiful, and our food is amazing, and trying to have conversations with my roommates about things like that too was really helpful. Not always, I didn't always get the response I was looking for, but I think I didn't regret not saying something in retrospect.
I can add on to that. Yeah, I just feel like my whole year abroad, because I was a non-heritage study abroad student, I was reflecting on my own identity as Asian American a lot, um, and then how my identity and my experiences shape the way that I think about identity, if that makes sense. Um, just to give an example, in Spanish, a lot of people will call anyone Asian Latina, or even if you're not Asian, my roommate had a friend group and one girl had slightly more slanted eyes, so that was her nickname, Latina, of that friend group. Um, and then another thing, yeah, it's very common. It's something that just happens in Spanish. Um, Another thing was that I had a friend point to me in identifying me to another friend, kind of pull her eyes back and point to me. And that was so jarring and so like it brought up, even now I'm thinking about it, it brought up a lot of like trauma from my childhood. Um, and I talked to this friend afterwards and I realized that it wasn't any like malintent. It was just, eyes or something like an identifying feature of Asians for the people in Chile. So we had long conversations about that, and I had to explain why that hurt me and why I would like them to not do that anymore. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of like um, cultural things that I know that obviously me, one person studying abroad for a year, I'm not gonna fix, or I'm not going to, shift the whole culture, but just starting to have conversations like that, and just being open to explaining, although sometimes it can be exhausting, explaining where I'm coming from, how my experiences, specifically being Asian in America, um, have kind of shaped my thoughts and um, what's appropriate for me and what's not appropriate.
I'm not sure if I can answer this in the way of like struggles. I think I was very lucky where the other people studying abroad, were there were also like a number of Asian Americans, and also I was there for like 6 weeks specifically for the program. I was technically there for longer, but my program was 6 weeks, so like shorter interactions. But I think what something I noticed was just how having like an American background versus having a Japanese background also affects like other aspects of identity, where I think I realized like within the lab I was in, it was like very male dominated. And also like there wasn't a lot of discussion about like religion. There wasn't a lot of discussion about like sexual orientation. And I think just things like that where especially coming from like my background and like going to UC Berkeley and things like that, there were a lot of things where it was like this is a very like normal conversation to have. But like in Japan, not necessarily that it was like hush hush or taboo, but it was just like something that I think was almost like taken for granted just because of like how normalized it was. And I think that was like a very interesting thing to experience.
Yeah, Justin, I'm gonna kind of coin off with, because you touched on something that the student who was able to hear had response was, and his response was actually he learned a lot about his maleness and what it means to be a male, identify as a male, being there, because there were so many stereotypes he ran into as being an Asian male, and he received a lot of he talks about a specific incident that was particularly challenging for him, that related to condoms and a myth that there are Asian condoms, for example, and how it was really, really hurtful for him. But then, being especially in a Scandinavian country where everyone is much taller and his quotes athletic, but he was saying that he learned more about what does it mean to be a male just as much as what it meant to be an Asian American. And so at the end, he was very grateful for that, and for that the opportunity to kind of really foster and solidify like what that meant. But I love that you touched on intersectionality, because our identities do cross over and they do bring things, and he was saying like, I'm not just Asian American, I'm also American Asian American male, and with that comes other just stuff essentially. But I wanted to bring that up because he specifically did mention that as a particular challenge that he faced with his study abroad. I'm going to jump to a few and this is mostly for Alicia, just because this was a question that was asked from one of the registered students, was were there any cultural products or resources you had difficulty locating?
Yeah, I obviously went into it not expecting to have access, especially food. I think food was a big thing, a big part of my understanding of my culture. So I just expected not to have access to it. I kind of, yeah, accepted that. So um, what I did find when I initially got there was that there's lots of Chinese food actually, um, but kind of more as an American export. So not necessarily what we would think, quote unquote, traditional Chinese food or authentic Chinese food, but more of Chinese food that has gone through America, and then American Chinese food, kind of like Panda Express food, even more like changed from its original form and then brought to Latin America. So I thought that was really interesting, like sushi with cream cheese in it, or like just very heavily sauced noodles and pad thai that was too sweet, things like that. Um, so I did try them a couple times, and I decided it wasn't for me. And then I did end up, as I mentioned, finding that kind of small Korean town and like the Asian markets, and I when I went there for the first time, I was with a friend, and he said that I looked like a kid in a candy store. Kind of just not, it was very hard for me to believe, or it was very surprising that these snacks and things so close to my culture was something that I could find kind of halfway across the world that I wasn't expecting to find. Um, so I'm grateful that I had access to that, but that was kind of like months and months into my study abroad experience. Um, yeah, and yeah, I guess that would be my answer.
Awesome. And then Elizabeth asked how were you able to recreate some things you were missing from home?
I actually, as a way to kind of, for like, I guess, comfort time, relaxation time, I started watching a lot of Chinese cooking videos on YouTube. Um, and then, yeah, this was kind of earlier in my study abroad experience in my year. So at this point, I didn't have access to all the ingredients, maybe basic things like soy sauce, but nothing like chili oil, sesame oil, things like that. Um, and I tried to cook a lot of the things that I ate growing up from my grandma. And obviously, they didn't turn out exactly the same, but it was enough for me to still feel connected and still have that sense of comfort. Um, and I guess it was just like my own version of that dish.
Thank you for sharing. I also want to jump to another question that was in the chat is, and for all three of you, what is something you wish you knew about being Asian abroad before going, before studying abroad? Or just in general, like what do you wish you had known? If you could give your former self advice, what would you have told yourself?
I wish I had studied abroad for a year. I did a semester abroad. I wish I had made it longer because it flies by. It really does. And so I don't regret not doing anything, but I think if I could have, I would have extended that. But it was during my senior year that I studied abroad, like the first, like the fall semester. And I had to come back to UCLA to take like a required class to graduate. And so if I could have, I maybe would have done it earlier if possible. And so ideally like a year like Alicia has.
So I'm gonna just try to answer the question more directly because I actually get asked this by students a fair amount. Where they will tell me like, I identify as Asian American and what's something that like what should I know? So there are some practical things. So for example, in general, like demographical information. So obviously your experience will be widely depending on where you are in your location and where you're staying. Usually you're going to a university, which with that comes some implications of it being more diverse. But that doesn't necessarily hold true, and that doesn't necessarily mean that your experience will be reflective of that. And so I think most students who I give that advice to are like, ooh, I'm really glad I did a little bit of research. I've had students who've just straight up like posted on the university's like subreddit, like, hey, identify as blank. In general, like, how will I be treated? Or are there any groups or orgs that I should connect with? And most of them have found really, really helpful responses. I've also had students like, I've had students be like, hey, can I get fresh tortillas? Like, just tell me straight up, is this impossible or is it possible? Or like, can I get, whatever, food or product and so that sometimes can be helpful too. I think that in general, I always say, uh, to expect to be asked the question of where you're from and about your background and have an answer ready. And your answer could be like, that's none of your business and I don't want to tell you. Your answer could be like, here's my whole family heritage. Sit down, and either way, whichever or whatever aspect within that spectrum, just have an answer ready so that way you have options and you're prepared. But my big piece of advice would be like, expect to be asked that. And also maybe reflect on your relationship with that question. And so that way you just know if you're triggered or not triggered, like you have your work kind of done ahead of time. So those are just some like general things that usually I tell students. Yeah. I'm going to just end, we have like 1 minute left. So like, is there any other like pieces of advice that like parting words of wisdom that you would want to give anyone who's considering study abroad?
Studying abroad was the second best decision of my life. And I was able to visit so many other countries, and I did an internship in Japan before like starting my fall semester and did so many things in that time period. Now that I'm like a working like adult, I look back really fondly on that time. And so if you can, it's an amazing experience. And I'd highly recommend it.
Go ahead.
So sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to second that. It sounds so cheesy, but yeah, studying abroad was just genuinely a life-changing experience. And then on the note of identity and Asian Americanness, just be open to it. Like, I'm sure wherever you go, heritage or non-heritage, you will get questions. Like Emily said, where are you from? Just things like that. So be open and be prepared, but um, share as much as you're comfortable with.
Plus one the previous two people. Genuinely life changing. I know it's the cliche thing to say about study abroad, but even other people I've talked to who've done study abroad say very similar things. I think also it's an experience to learn both about like the culture that you are going to visit, but also a lot of like learning about yourself and being placed in an environment that you probably aren't used to, which is the entire purpose of study abroad. And I think being able to do that, if you have the ability to, like, no matter where you choose, you do learn a lot about yourself. And I think it's a wonderful experience because of that.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists for being here. We really, really, really appreciate it. We literally would not have a panel without you. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And I hope that everyone has a great day.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.